Blah, blah. Welcome to Framework and Spooky Season. We're talking about elevated horror today. I am John, one of the hosts of Framework, and with me, as always, the other host of Framework, Al. Welcome to the podcast.
Yes, that's me. The Dracula thing is the least elevated of horror, right?
Nope, it's not elevated horror at all. That's right.
Well, until Robert Eggers' Nosferatu comes out.
Yep.
Then we can have the elevated version. And elevating us today is is this third or fourth time on the podcast? I'm not,
sixth or seventh, I think.
But yes, Mr. Brett Blake is returning to educate us. 6 or 7. Wow, God, time is just a cruel mistress.
I don't know if I'm here to educate, but thank you for having me back.
Yeah. Well, you're kind of one of our go-to guys, especially for the genre of horror. You know,
right?
Me and you in particular, I think have spoken quite a bit about horror. We were kind of doing that while you were away for a moment there, Al. We were talking about old Italian horror films starring Britt Eklund, just in the interim. So, you know, you're a guy we'd like to have on for Halloween and October conversations about about scary movies. And today, the subject at hand is the sort of, would you call this a subgenre?
Sure.
The new movement in horror, popular over the last 10 years or so, sort of colloquially known as elevated horror. Now, if you know me, you know there's nothing I like more than discussing the different varieties of subgenres of the horror mega genre and cataloging films within them. That's my thing.
That's why you're so popular with the ladies.
Just so, yeah. Uh-huh. They're always coming up to me talking about what would you consider is Tenebrae technically a giallo or is it more just a Hitchcockian thriller? You know, and I'm just like, well, anyway,
that classic porn movie scenario.
Yeah.
Anyway, so am I on the anti side of this? Is that my position?
Well,
is there a debate moderator? Do we need a pro and a con?
I don't know what I feel about this subgenre, if we are indeed allowing that it is one, because this is a contentious term within the horror community. Actually, there's a lot of feelings about what elevated horror is and what it means, and whether it's whether it means anything at all, whether it's an insult, etc.
Yeah,
I think it is something of an insult,
kind of
to non-elevated horror.
I've got, speaking of a lot of feelings, like I have a lot of feelings about it, and I'm not even fully sure entirely where I come down on how I ultimately feel about it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I you questioned, is this a subgenre? I would say more it's a sub-classification.
Yeah.
Because I was looking at, I Googled, the list of elevated horror movies just to see what Google thought was an elevated horror film. And there are all kinds of different types of movies within that show up. There are monster movies. There are serial killer thrillers. It's a varied term that can cover a whole bunch of different stuff across the horror subgenres.
And that's why it's maybe not useful is the thing. Maybe it's I don't know if it's sort of just a flash in the pan, pretentious way of discussing these movies when, a couple good art horror films came out, basically. We got, I think I was kind of looking into this. They've been making movies of this type forever. The Haunting is an elevated horror film. The Shining is.
Don't Look Now.
Yeah, there's tons that would technically qualify. I think the modern movement, I believe, starts with The Babadook, I think, for lack of a better starting point. I think that's probably the one that's just like, here's the thing. We're doing movies like this for a while. It's very successful. People like it. They make more like it.
What I had seen...
Yeah, that and then The Witch came pretty close on heels, right?
What I had seen trying to determine, where did the term sort of originate? And I couldn't pin down an exact origin point, but one of the articles I read said a British film journalist coined it in relation to The Witch.
Okay.
But The Witch and The Babadook came out roughly the same, within like 12 months of each other. So that, 2014, 2015, that's sort of the point where I think it sort of began to appear as a phrase in sort of film discussion and film criticism.
Yeah. That sounds right. It feels right. And I think both of those movies are sort of the major offerings of elevated horror, maybe. Like they're sort of defining what people mean when they talk about it. There's other ones, of course. I think Hereditary is right up there in the mix, but those three basically are, if there's a Mount Rushmore, it's those three and another one. And
so Hereditary fits the bill then for you.
Yes.
That is one that I did like put it on the list, but I thought about it more than the others, being like, it feels so much gnarlier in its horror, like
all pretty gnarly
stuff it's going for.
The Witch is pretty gnarly.
It feels less classy than The Witch in its presentation to me.
Yeah. If you look at on paper what is going on in Hereditary, it could very easily be schlock. Like it could very easily be, very junky, very trashy. It could have been a 70s exploitation premise for sure. I mean, I'm sure there were 70s exploitation films that had that premise. That's kind of actually my problem with Hereditary, is that I think it builds up all of this atmosphere, and sort of the filmmaking leads you to believe you're going to see something that is, on a different level in terms of story. But what it ultimately is revealed to be is like, oh, it's one of these.
Yeah. I mean,
that sounds very much like my 2-star review of Midsommar.
I'd love to talk about that movie, because I have very strong feelings about how that is not even a horror film, but we don't have to get into that right now.
We could.
We could get into the larger Ari Aster conversation, because I think he's a huge piece of, when people think of elevated horror, they're kind of thinking about or describing his movies in a certain way. Today, when they're talking about it today, he is sort of the poster child for that kind of thing. And this is getting into the area of sort of the ways in which I don't like this term, which goes to the idea of, it feels like people, and it's not even the fault of the filmmakers necessarily, or the movies themselves, because a lot of the time this is like a title that is conferred upon a film. Someone from the outside, a critic or the horror community or the film watching community, is decreeing this is an example of elevated horror. So I don't often like to hold that against the film itself, because they probably didn't invite that directly. But in the case of Ari Aster, he feels like a filmmaker who's kind of embarrassed to be working in the subject matter that he's working in. I think you see that in terms of him in Hereditary, working overtime in terms of the cinematic style to kind of elevate what is on paper, as I said, kind of a schlock concept. And he probably felt like, I'm going to take these very common horror ideas and horror tropes and really soup them up and give them the veneer of respectability. And then that movie's a success, and I like Hereditary for the most part. And then he moves on to Midsommar, and I feel like he just has no interest in the genre whatsoever, because the genre elements in that film are so sort of cursory and perfunctory to me that it feels like, to me, he felt, I have to include this because my previous film was a horror movie, but I'm really much more interested in sort of this weirdo character psychodrama between two people who really need to break up. And that's really what the story is. And I see it more as kind of a twisted comedy than a horror film, because even at its darkest moments, I think it's funny.
I think all his movies are funny. I think Ari Aster is a very talented comedian or comic filmmaker, at least. Like, even Hereditary, I find a lot to laugh at in that film. All the business with where they're doing a Ouija board, it's just like, this is the worst thing you could do. What are you doing? It's funny. There's an element of camp to the Toni Collette performance. That's kind of part of the charm of them for me. And I mean, Beau is Afraid, his third film is, I mean, that one I can't call a horror film at all. I think it's just a comedy that happens to be terrifying, because that's just sort of how he makes films. But his artistic sensibilities are so front page. You know, they're so obvious when you watch the film that you're watching an art picture, or where the shots have been selected very carefully and purposefully. The music cues, the everything appears fussed over in a way that makes it very clear you're watching cinema. This is, I think, something that people are talking about when we talk about elevated horror. This is true of Babadook and The Witch as well. Purposeful direction that draws attention to itself, maybe, which I don't think is a bad thing. I don't mean that pejoratively, but it is a thing.
Well, it's an aesthetic, like you said.
Yeah,
it's a sheen of serious and of artistic purpose, I suppose. Turning up its nose, perhaps, is the negative way of saying it. But your elevated horror is one that's not going to revel in the joys of low horror, of the slasher. They're not being particularly gory. Most likely
they are.
They can be, yeah.
Which, well, I mean, I guess Hereditary's got the head sawing image. It's kind of gory.
Other head imagery.
There's enough there.
Is also pretty shocking in that film.
Yeah.
Oh, but yeah, I guess you do see something rotting later on. Yeah. Well,
you sure do.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think this is part of what people bristle at. Their real horror heads is that it seems to suggest that these are horror movies with more important things on their mind than being scary or gross.
I think there's something to that. I also think, and again, this isn't something that's necessarily the fault of any of these movies, whether I like all of them or not. The idea that you sometimes get from film critics who might dub a film elevated horror, it's like a way of giving themselves a pass for enjoying and recommending this genre by sort of stamping this imprimatur of, oh, this is prestigious. This has artistic sensibilities that I can defend. And that kind of does annoy me, because I think the horror genre is a great genre. The horror genre can allow you to explore almost any kind of story that you want to within these genre parameters. And the idea that we have to, quote unquote, elevate a film out of the genre to a separate category, a separate classification, kind of just rubs me the wrong way. Like, the horror genre is not a ghetto that somebody needs to transcend in order to become respectable. Like, you can be very respectable, fully embracing, the horror tropes of the genre, and you will be well remembered throughout history. I mean, Alien, The Exorcist, The Omen, Night of the Living Dead.
Those were the original elevated horror movies, though.
I mean, yeah, but the term didn't exist then. And critics didn't feel like, those films were well reviewed. Those films were well respected at the time. I think there's a strain of modern film criticism that really turns its nose up at the genre and needs a way to distinguish, okay, these are the ones that I can feel good about saying are really good movies. So I'm going to say, oh, this is elevated horror. So that distinguishes it from just regular old horror that is trash that I don't want anything to do with.
It is a contemptuous phrase, just inside itself. I mean, like, no, it's better than horror. It's it's right there in the name, and yeah, I think the sort of veneer of pretension, even this can be part of the marketing, even an A24 logo at this point kind of says like it's better than horror, kind of a little bit, and that is a thing. And there's definitely some directors that we will get to, I'm sure, that are actively pretentious filmmakers. I think I love Ari Aster. There are others that I don't. And that kind of junks it up and makes it a little bit more like, oh, that's the bad version of it that you can point at.
I mean, this goes beyond horror, though, right? I feel like this has been a feature of the 2000s. Since Nolan took on Batman, and we started getting elevated superhero films, and then we got elevated Bond movies in the Craig era that were trying to be more serious and showing their work and their cinematography more than on Her Majesty's Secret Service might have. we got Game of Thrones, and now like elevated fantasy is sort of more of a thing that everybody feels a little obligated to include a little more toes in the real world in their fantasy, and we're trying to, I think Rings of Power is currently like tripping over itself, trying to introduce some psychological complexity and realism to the orcs and Sauron, the Deceiver, and it's not that great of a fit. And I think the reason why elevated horror stands out from all these other like genres versions of it, I think, is because it is such a mismatch of a fit. Like, one of the worst things that a horror movie could be is pretentious.
Yeah,
pretentious fantasy. Okay, you get away with a little more there, I think, but pretentious horror, it feels like a contradiction in terms of itself.
Well, horror is also really well suited to be used as allegory and metaphor.
Yes.
You can tell, as you were saying, Brett, kind of any story. You can make any point, and you can kind of get away with a lot more in this genre than you can in others, because there's zombies or aliens or whatever involved. There's a distancing thing that doesn't make it feel like it's so directly, pointedly in your face about stuff. And so, you'll see the new movement in horror, which is adjacent but not entirely limited to elevated horror, is horror as a metaphor for trauma. Like it's dealing with Babadook is doing this explicitly, and a lot of films since have done it. Which is like this is. I'm
amazed we got 15 minutes into this elevated horror talk without mentioning the word trauma.
Well,
it's like the watchword of elevated horror.
Yeah, right now it's huge. It's huge, but like aside from the movie Smile that came out a few years ago, that is explicitly what that is doing. No one would dare call that one elevated horror. It's a Ring ripoff where people smile at you, scary, but it is nonetheless doing it's actually a metaphor for trauma. This represents mental illness. It's doing all that stuff that is kind of becoming codified tropes at this point in horror. It worked so well in the Babadook that it seems obvious that it would continue to be used in that way. That is the most explicit one, maybe, and it's the key to that film working. And it's also done in in a stylish way that is also very easy to understand and read. Like that's an allegory that everyone gets and can feel smart for getting. Like you watch that movie and you're like, oh yeah, it's the specter of her father, of her husband's death, and it's haunting them. I understand that. It's making her crazy in the way that she can't deal with it. It's curdling her relationship with her son. Oh, but she can't ever get rid of it. It's just going to be kind of locked in the basement. It's managed. It is managed trauma, and isn't that how it is? It works. It works very well. So of course it becomes a thing that people keep doing. I'm kind of surprised we don't have a franchise of Babadook movies at this point, actually.
I think the Jennifer Kent had to very deliberately keep the keys to that herself and not allow it.
And thank goodness, because if we had gotten, the Hollywoodized versions, it would have been much tackier, much cheesier, much less artfully and thoughtfully composed than that original film is.
Of course.
Yeah, and it's so like self-consciously artfully composed. Like that is it, like I said, it's impossible to miss. It's allegory for the cheap seats.
But also what it does well is it doesn't allow its allegory and its thematic concerns to completely subsume its ability to function as a genre piece. Like, it is still a well-crafted, spooky movie with great horror imagery in it.
Yeah, the Babadook is actually present. He's yes. In the world of the movie. There's a ghost named the Babadook living in their house. So yeah, it's not.
He's got a little top hat. He's great. He's a great design. I love him.
Yeah, he is great.
Yeah, I mean that the book in that movie is just so well designed. The illustrations and everything, like characters reading a pop-up children's story on screen should be just like really boring to watch. And that book is just so well drawn and rendered that it is genuinely spooky, even as it's a fairly silly conceit to have this monster pop-up book.
But it works.
Terrifying her. Yeah.
It's so well executed. And it's interesting, like the first Blu-ray edition that came out of that was like a limited version where the slip cover you'd open up a fold on the slipcover and you got a pop-up, one of the pages from that book. I have that edition. It's great.
Yeah, it's a hot one. Here's the thing though, like John Carpenter's Halloween, I think you could make the argument is kind of an artistic achievement in its own right that does some things beyond what,
absolutely
inventing slashers sort of thing, and none of that is dimmed by 12 Halloween movies that came afterwards. Wouldn't it be kind of fun if we had, by now, like another 2 or 3 Babadook movies that had been made? They were just
Babadook 3, Dream Warriors? Sure.
Yeah. Like, they're just doing some of the sleazy versions of it. This is the sort of thing that elevated horror precludes, though. Like, you can't get a massive run of franchise slasher films because it's more than horror. It's better than horror. And that might be
that's
fun.
why A24 has to kind of position itself as the franchise.
Yeah. Yeah, very much
that's
so.
interesting,
Yeah.
Well, I think you hit on some. This allegory stuff is important because I do think that's the defining aspect of this to me, is that these are movies that are very like theme forward in their presentation. And I think also this is in some ways a reaction to the rise of the internet, and sort of it's a weird way that I would not have anticipated, but I functions as a way that the internet changed audiences. Whereas, because these are movies for the critics, right? That's the critique of this genre, is that these are for critics and not for audiences. But the internet made everybody more of a critic in the audience. And now, like, because of the way those conversations are democratized and happening so much faster and all that, it's not all confined to the weird section of the video store. The audience gets a bigger charge or more value, I suppose, out of being able to identify the allegory and discuss it and all that. And I don't think I'm sounding nearly pejorative enough in the way I'm describing this. This is bad for the movies. I don't like it when they're trying to be these. You're trying to take a genre that should work on a gut level and try and map them out into being perfect, like airtight allegories for the trauma they're exploring, whether it's of a bad breakup or a dead husband or whatever.
Well, when it's good, I think you can have both. Yes. I think the Babadook exactly. That's a movie that definitely achieves both, and I think this is also leads to more ambitious films getting out, and it's not just the constant churn of Final Destination sequels or like the sort of things that we were getting in the 90s. And, we're all nostalgic for 90s horror stuff now. But at the same time, like how many I Know What You Did Last Summer's got made, at that time that aren't worth saving or remembering. Nowadays, elevated horror, you can make a movie like Skinamarink and kind of people will see it and it'll turn a nice little profit on that. And that's, that is purely just like an art film, It does kind of also traffic in this sort of experiential gut level dread that, if it's working, you're getting that too. I think it's kind of an exciting thing. And there is a sense that this renewed interest in artistic horror is kind of a tide that raises all ships. We're still getting slasher movies, a new Terrifier movie is still going to come out, but we're getting a lot more kinds of horror movies than we used to. Sure. And yes, they become codified. Yes, they become tropey. And, we see a lot of the same, chasing the success of the Babadook or what have you. But it's still kind of exciting. It's certainly better than where we were before, which was Saw movies and Paranormal Activity movies. So I think it's a really good thing for the genre, even as it is rankling to a lot of people.
You're backing me into a corner if I have to start defending Saw as the alternative. But I think my counter, my con position on that would be that what you call, these are artistically minded horror movies. I think the negative spin on that is you getting more didactic horror movies.
Oh, and I don't mind that.
I don't think that's a good adjective to apply to a horror movie. But
Get Out is a very didactic horror film, and it's a great one.
It is. I don't think it's that great of a horror movie. I think it's a good movie.
Yeah. See, I kind of agree with Al on that one. I'm more of an Us fan at this point. So if we're talking about Jordan Peele and his elevated horror,
well, is he elevated horror?
Us is more of a horror movie, and honestly, Us might work better for me at this point. Not necessarily better than Get Out, but better than it did initially. because if it's aiming for this elevated horror, didactic allegorical thing, it is so impenetrable in what it's actually doing that it still manages to work on a less cerebral level. Whereas these people
it
are
works
smiling
as a more
at
visceral
creepy and
horror
scary me.
experience than Get
Definitely.
Out does. But John, you asked the question: does Jordan Peele make elevated horror movies? That could maybe get to another question: is can you be an elevated horror film if you're released by one of the major studios? Does it have to be does it have to have
so.
indie cred behind it to even some extent in order to get that moniker? Like, I would consider, by just looking at like the script of Get Out, that's an elevated horror movie that fits alongside any of the other ones that you would find on these lists. Yes, it's probably overtly and intentionally funnier than a lot of those movies are, just because Jordan Peele is a very funny person. But, I think in terms of its subject matter, what it's dealing with, the allegory, the metaphor, all, what have you, all that stuff, I think it absolutely, checks a lot of those boxes.
Yeah, well, the allegory is so forward there. That's the thing. Like, it is, as much as the Babadook, it is operating on fairly purely allegorical terms. Like, what its themes are in your face. They're there for the cheap seats, even though they are technically, but maybe only technically subtext.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's true of, like all his films. Yes, Us is tons of weird allegory, tons of metaphors and ideas that are not clearly articulated. And yes, it still might be the best one of them. But all three of them, yeah, they have a lot of theming, a lot of subtext and allegory. And yet at the same time, I find those to be very populist films. All three of them are,
I agree with that.
Playing for an audience. They have
Nope is Jaws.
Yeah, Nope is
in the air instead of the water.
It's the most
and they
pretentious
mostly
version
hit.
that it could be, but it works. It totally works for an audience. It's a big audience movie. They all have happy endings, for God's sakes. I mean, he's doing big audience movies.
He's doing the popcorn version of elevated horror. We can maybe say that. He's doing, the more crowd pleasing version of this kind of movie.
That's my knock on him as a horror director is that the happy endings are too happy and too consistent. Like, I really, if he wants to, not that he needs to care about this, but if he wants to like keep the master of horror label in my books, I think he needs to go for a downer ending on the next one.
I do think Us could be read as a downer ending. I mean, the last shots of that movie kind of do not imply great things are about to happen across the United States. But
well, they kind of imply that things have settled down.
It all worked out for our family, though.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the main thing. Yeah,
things are much better than they were in the second act.
Maybe Peele's trajectory sort of went in a bigger, more populist direction because of the success of Get Out. Like, I don't know that he necessarily thought making that movie. Did anyone think that was going to make almost $200 million worldwide?
Nominated for Best Picture, wins Best Writing.
So I think
you can't let yourself think that way. I imagine.
Knowing Peele, he loves all kinds of movies. Big movies, small movies, populist movies, escapist movies, downer movies. He loves it all. You can just tell, from the sketch comedy he did and all that stuff. But I do wonder if the success of Get Out set him out on, okay, I'm going to tell the stories I want to tell that may be about these allegorical fixations or preoccupations or things that interest me, but I'm going to do them on a canvas for the mass audience.
Oh, totally. It's the same thing that happened to M. Night Shyamalan. And that's scary, actually, for Jordan Peele, because, M. Night Shyamalan's last big hit of his huge, next Spielberg run was, a sort of a low-key alien picture as well, his third film. And then it was onto The Village and a massive drop-off. So I think that is very much Peele's trajectory right now, and I hope he's able to avoid that. I mean, it was a massive trap for Shyamalan.
I don't think Shyamalan's issue was that he went too populist. I think it was that he typecast himself. It's hard to blame anybody else for putting that straitjacket on him, but he just felt like he had to repeat the same trick over and over. And it's a very difficult one to repeat.
Made 3 similar films in a row now. He's made 3 somewhat elevated horror, somewhat populist cinema, sort of crowd pleasers that deal in thematic ideas as well as visceral horror.
But that's a trick that can be repeated more like ad nauseum than
perhaps
giant twist that nobody sees coming, because now everybody's on regard for it. the third
I
and fourth
suppose
time
so.
around.
But it is sort of a limited, what if he wants to do a rom-com now? Like, can he make anything other than another one of these movies? Remains to be seen. Or can he make people come to it, I guess? I'm sure he can make another kind of movie.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. He's got to... They can't all be giant blockbuster hits if he's going to, try and do different things. They're going to have different reactions to them. We're doing the Coen brothers right now. There's going to be a Hudsucker Proxy in there somewhere.
Presumably, but he's kind of also positioned as a big hit moneymaker guy too. So there's more incentive for him to keep doing the successful thing. The Coens didn't have a hit until Fargo, really.
Well, the Coens are actually an interesting comparison point for this, because as much as actually I do for elevated horror, I feel like it's a genre where I like the whole a lot less than I like the parts, because a lot of these movies, the Babadook works great. I like The Witch, all these. I like Hereditary. As a whole, I find myself I harump at the concept. I think I bristle in some of the same ways Brett was talking about the idea that horror needs to be elevated, and I kind of think, like, at least on theoretical terms, elevated is a bad thing for horror to be even angling for. Like, and I think of it again. Elevation's a weird word, because I think of it more about allegory. And allegorical horror, it makes it a cerebral experience rather than a gut experience. And that's where the gut should live. And it's not that movies that work on a gut level don't have these ideas in them. But is Jordan Peele's Us? Is Carpenter's The Thing? Are these movies, would they be more effective if they're allegorical? If The Thing was a more explicit AIDS allegory, and that reading really was airtight. I think it's more effective on a visceral level, and then therefore more effective on all levels, because it is not quite as easy to pin the thing down. Its form is constantly changing on you and so forth. And that's the way I feel about a lot of our conversations about the Coens, is when we've been doing that lately, John, the impulse here in the structure of a podcast is to try and nail down these thematic readings and
right.
Say it means this, and that's why you tell chart this symbol goes through here. The hats of Miller's Crossing mean this and this and this, except when they don't. And I think that Coen overall, their films maintain a lot more power because they are not as airtight allegorically as we, our armchair critics on the internet want them to be.
I mean, that's the problem of, forcing allegory into a story. It's I guess it is by necessity going to occur in a story, allegory, but it's also, you very much run the risk of the cart driving the horse, I guess. Yeah. I think that's, what we kind of thing we come back to. And I do also think that almost all horror movies are allegorical in some context. Even Jason Voorhees, he's a death avatar. It's just kind of in the text, that there's an inherent transgression in anything, and that can kind of be, an overlay on whatever you need it to be when you're coming to the story. It's usually death, but it's
the question. I think the question that begs is, would any of the Friday the 13th movies be improved if we saw, on his Jason's birth certificate, that his middle name was Thanatos?
Maybe Michael Myers traffics in this sometimes, and it works. It's really good. It's
no, and the more he traffics, isn't that the worse it gets? Isn't that the rule of thumb in the Halloween franchise?
Oh no! It's the more he has a backstory is the worse it gets. I don't know. Most of those movies are bad. Is the other thing. I still kind of love them, but the majority of Michael Myers films are bad. I would have to say, and that's probably true of all of the slasher films, right? Got to be. I don't know. I think most of the Chucky movies are better than are good. I'll go there. I'll say.
Oh, I don't know about that.
They get better the more meta they get, though. That's, I mean.
Well, that one keeps changing its sensibilities. It goes from being a pretty pure killer doll movies to sort of satirical ones to completely satirical ones, back into a different kind of mode, and then they become very meta, and then it's a television show. It just changes forms constantly. I mean, if we're talking about allegory and theme and ideas and stuff, those are those might qualify as elevated horror, even though they're the trashiest films you've ever seen. They have a lot of the hallmarks, and this is another reason maybe that this is not a useful phrase.
Is there a line to be drawn between allegory and meta? Like,
sure.
Scream is not elevated, even though it's so meta. It's idea forward, But
yeah,
I don't think the Scream franchise is elevated.
I think in order to truly be elevated, I think it has to have some sort of critical acclaim, because I think that is a component. The phrase originated apparently with a film critic, and it is used most often in film writing and film criticism. So, like, the Chucky movies are not acclaimed films by critics, certainly. The first one did pretty well with critics, but I think in order to truly be elevated today, there has to be some component of critics saying, well, this is actually good and worth your time.
Yeah, and I think Child's Play as a franchise is it's such an oddball idea and has taken such weird turns that it's not going to be the best one from which to derive universal laws. Halloween as a franchise, it's so pure as a slasher that yes, you can sketch out the laws of slashers using Halloween as your playbook. But Child's Play is too idiosyncratic, I think, to fit the larger form of the genre very well. Yeah. It's not so much as above, so below stuff there.
You're right. It's crazy that came up in a conversation about elevated horror. Sorry.
I'm glad.
No, I see the distinction you're making, though. The being idea first and the first, and the meta-ness versus sociological allegory. That's, I guess, Scream and Child's Play. Their meta-ness is so like internal. They're not like necessary societal concerns that are being addressed by it.
No, it's meta in the way that the scary movie franchise is meta, I suppose.
Or Last Action Hero.
Yes, that's better. That's what it is. And that's, I mean, even that is a form of subversiveness, I guess. Like if Scream is the first one you see as a kid, then you're just like, wow, they're actually thinking about the thing. This is different. There's always people like us, pickled movie brain. We've talked about this. We kind of seen a lot of the ideas and things done in some way, over the thousands of films we've watched. Some audiences are going to be discovering this stuff for the first time always. So, and a lot of kids go to horror movies, a lot of teenagers, it's a place to introduce ideas. So I think,
for what it's worth, when I saw Scream as a kid, it worked on me entirely on a visceral level. Like that opening sequence fucked me up as a 12-year-old.
It's a great movie. It's a great movie. The first Scream is excellent. It's just a terrifically done slasher film. And
it's one of those that just balances the tone so perfectly, because yes, especially if you're watching it as an adult with a lot of knowledge of the genre, you admire the cleverness and sort of the freshness of the writing, but it also, just like you said, on that visceral level, like it fully works as a horror movie, as a slasher movie. Like the opening 15 minutes, the closing half hour, that's full on, horror thrill ride, really trying to freak out the audience. And I think it works totally on that level.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I think there's something very astute about the way Scream opens with I guess it's still fairly meta, but its scariest and most vicious sequence, and that allows, I think, some of the other bigger flights of egg-headed fancy in the middle to still carry some tension and scares with them, and because I know that whole sequence. That whole movie scared me more than a lot of these more elevated horror. Like now that when I recognize I'm sitting down for an elevated horror movie, there is part of my brain that's not engaged with the, visceral danger to the characters, because I'm just piecing together theme puzzles in my head. and also like a little on guard for, okay, are we going to find out this is all just explicitly a metaphor and nobody actually got I'm always on guard to whether I'm watching an Identity. Again.
You won't identity me again.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting point about, what are my expectations when I sit down to watch something that has been dubbed an elevated horror film. And I'm not going to lie, my initial gut reaction when I hear that something is elevated horror is how boring is this going to be? Because
Well,
I think there are some that are not, like It Comes at Night, for example. That's one that I think is
Okay.
kind of a textbook elevated horror film for a lot of people. I think that's an awful movie. And I did not get my money's worth, and I was not impressed in any way whatsoever. And I understand what the filmmaker is going for. I'm just not interested.
That's a movie I wanted to bring up because I think that is actually a significant moment in the life cycle of elevated horror. Is It Comes at Night, which is A24. I'm pretty sure, right?
I'm sure.
It is. Yeah. If not, it's Annapurna. It is absolutely marketing itself as, an elevated horror movie. It's an elevated horror film, except the marketing team kind of overemphasized what sort of horror you'd be getting watching it. It is presented as a much more approachable,
as a monster movie.
Yeah, like you're going to see something. They're trying to keep something out. Something's going to come at night, presumably, based on the title. And it's not that kind of film. It's about sowing distrust and how well you know people. But it doesn't really work. It is a frustrating, boring movie, and largely irritating in its allegory. And it sort of becomes the poster child for what people are talking about with the problem with elevated horror as a term. It is. This is, I guess, when the internal revolt within the horror community revolting against elevated horror begins, I believe. Around
the cart is way ahead of the horse on that one. The rap. Yeah.
It's
well, that's the thing.
It just kind of sucks. It's just kind of a bad movie, and they want And there's other ones that have done this. Mother, the Darren Aronofsky film, is a good example of cart before the horse allegory in a big way.
Yeah. Although I will say, just slightly in Mother's defense, I think the filmmaking is so strong there that like I'm at least constantly engaged, especially like in the back half of the movie. I'm just so engaged by how Aronofsky is like using the camera and using production design that like at least it's visually engaging. At least there's something cinematically happening that I'm interested in.
It's also like so brazen about its allegorical.
It's not hiding
it. It's putting them right in front and center from the start. Yeah. I think that what's aggravating is, I guess and I don't even know what my example of this is, but when the filmmaker is being too cute about their allegory, and you as a viewer are sitting there thinking like, okay, I think you're trying to like sneak past me a little bit on this, but no, I see. Yes, it's. The real aliens were the trauma all along. And that's, I think it goes back to what John was saying about how like, yeah, every monster is going to be a metaphor at some point or on some level. So for your movie, I think you may as well have people being attacked by a monster that's within the reality of the movie as a monster. And because people being attacked by a metaphor is not very compelling, I don't think.
Well, I think that is kind of It Comes at Night. I mean, that is sort of what that is.
It
Comes at Night is basically like let's take the themes of the thing, paranoia and distrust, and you don't trust anybody, but let's leave out all of the cool Rob Bottin creature stuff. And maybe a filmmaker like John Carpenter with Kurt Russell could still make that a good tense thriller, but I want the goopy, slimy monsters.
Yeah, John Carpenter would never. He wants the goop. He's more interested in the goop than the metaphor, and that's why the thing what's so crazy. Yeah, it's so crazy about. Well, but he also made The Ward, which was basically was the last time I got identitied. You son of a bitch, Carpenter. No, but the lessons of the thing were so clear. You could have it all. You put the monster ahead of the metaphor, and then you get to have it all. When you put the metaphor in front of the monster, then I think you end up with less.
I agree.
That's largely true. Yeah, I think that as a rule of thumb, yeah, I can't think of a lot of films that are like metaphor first that totally succeed. You got to have the thing that's actually.
Well, the Babadook, I guess, would be the number one example.
Even still, you got a Babadook in there.
Yeah, I think the actual supernatural component of that movie is strong enough that it balances out nicely. But this kind of gets to my point of.
Well, actually, hit on the Babadook one
sure.
worth point about that. I think what makes that word work for me is that even if you go in for like the psychological reading where there is no Babadook, that doesn't mean that there is no danger throughout that movie, because it means that the
Sure.
danger is that she is going to hurt her child, not that the Babadook is going to hurt them, but the threat remains, as opposed to an identity where it turns out you're murdering imaginary figments of your imagination, and nobody's actually in. The physical danger is completely false, because it's all
spoilers for
I hesitate to even call that a metaphor, but whatever the fuck that's doing.
I mean, maybe the witch actually is a bigger part of this conversation than it has been up to this point, because that's exactly what the witch is doing too. Like the choice to show the witch 20 minutes into that film,
brilliant.
It's like, nope, there's a fucking witch here. It's like an old crone living in the woods with a flying broomstick, and she snatches children away and she eats them, and that's all real. And then with that knowledge, you go and have sort of a psychological horror film for the rest of the thing, knowing there's a goddamn witch just outside of the view of the cabin somewhere, and
presenting the threat.
The film.
Yeah, presenting the threat as something that is real and is not ambiguous or subject to the audience questioning, well, is this just like the paranoia of the family manifesting in a, no, it's like there's a real witch. She's really killing children. She's preying upon this family. She's out there. That's brilliant choice for that story.
There's also the reading of that they show you the shot of the corn has, I think it's called ergot rot on it, but it's this form of rot that can have a hallucinogenic effect.
But we didn't eat that. The audience didn't eat that. So, I mean, the movie is showing us things that the characters don't see. We're put in a position of knowing that, the threat to this family is perhaps even more real than they think it is.
Well, you could interpret that as it's the family's fears in some way, like manifesting on screen for us. But
that's
again,
careful,
but just like the Babadook, it's even if you go with that interpretation, they are still a threat to each other, and they are really killing each other over it. So it's like the metaphor does not obviate the threat. It
still works on a metaphorical level either way, but as a movie, I much prefer the version where there's, an actual, witch in the woods, and there's an actual coven, and Satan, comes to Earth personified as Black Phillip, and eventually as like this pirate type character who shows up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I prefer all that, I think, Robert Eggers is one of the most exciting filmmakers to me right now, not just because he's got such a great visual style, but because I think he tells genre stories in an interesting way. And you could really see, he sort of exploded, fully formed with The Witch, and his embrace of like, yes, I'm going to quote unquote elevate this with, allegorical, metaphorical, thematic stuff related to, what was Puritan society like? What are teenage girls like in this structure? Yes, the movie's about all this, but it's also about a witch who turns infants into, baby jam.
Yeah. Well, he's doing this incredible thing. I mean, The Witch is a wild debut picture. I mean, it's as fully formed as something like Thief. It is essentially his Thief, if he's, going to continue to do movies of this. Yeah. Okay. His deal is takes folklore from specific places and specific times, Puritan England, the Vikings and the belief in Valhalla and the gods and shit, or sort of maritime stuff in the lighthouse. And it's all a reflection of the societies that they came from. It's really fascinating. It's like the crazy shit the Puritans believed, that is based on the lifestyle that they had in the American frontier, that it's sort of this harsh and unforgiving world that they exist in. And of course the devil's hiding behind the woods. The lighthouse makes a really good case that it's that all the beliefs in like the mer people and weird sea mythology kind of comes from this sort of innate loneliness and isolation that they're feeling, in the lighthouse or on a ship, and just sort of stuck with these certain people that they can't escape because of their location. And then Northman is all Well, yeah, they were they believed in a lot of war shit because they were crazed from murdering all the time. They were their entire lives were devoted to combat and violence
and hallucinogens.
So, yeah, well, so it's folklore that is a manifestation of the world they live in every case, and I'm sure Nosferatu is going to be the same deal. It's perfect for that. So
I can't wait for that.
I'm over the moon for him. I love Robert Eggers. Poster boy for elevated horror, though.
And I don't think he is that comfortable with that. I don't think that he wants to be confined to horror as a genre. But I mean, even The Northman was kind of a horror tinged, whatever it was.
I think The Witch is kind of the only one that's a proper horror film that he's made.
I agree with that.
There, yeah.
In terms of style, like he's got a very genre kind of approach to how he composes imagery. So I think, that's why we would sort of feel like The Lighthouse and The Northman are sort of tinged with horror, even though, like you, John, I don't really consider them horror films.
I mean, The Lighthouse kind of doesn't have another genre you can put it in, really.
No, it's kind of unclassifiable.
That's part of the issue.
But
yeah.
Well, the other thing about Eggers, I think, and you kind of see this around the reaction to The Witch, is, I mean, he strikes me as a guy who is really disinclined to tell anybody that they're wrong about an interpretation of a movie or a story or whatever. But also that he seemed to have some chagrin about how far people were taking readings about it being about a parable of feminist empowerment, and that's like, it's all about.
That's a wrong reading, I would say. Yeah.
Yes, it is. I mean, listen, I don't want to
right or wrong. I think it just goes against what Eggers really wanted to do with that movie on such a basic level, which is, I was really trying to do the opposite of allegory. I was trying to immerse, like the point of the exercise was immersing you in a culture, in a world that is alien to us.
Here's the witch. Look, there's an actual witch.
And the whole thing is about making us live in Puritan, New England for 2 hours, and people's entire reaction to it was based on how can we bring as much 21st century politics into it as we can.
Yeah,
and I think that it seems like that shat him a little bit. Even I'm reading between the lines.
And I think Midsommar kind of is in a similar sort of vein where I don't like to say people are reading a film wrong or taking the wrong interpretation from something, but like the ending of that movie, where I saw so many people were like, "Whoa, you go, girl!" Like this is the
exact same thing.
This is not going to end well for her in any way, and the people she's now found sort of this family with, they're not good people.
I like that, though. I think that's funny, in fact.
Do I, but I'm talking about people who read it as like this is some kind of empowering statement. Like it's really not.
Well, but that's where the movie ends.
Yeah, but they realize it's a Taylor Swift song of a movie to some people.
I like that about it because, yes, you have the aspect of it that you're saying, which is this is pretty fucked up. I think it's like day 5 of like a 19-day festival or something. I don't know if those numbers are right, but it's essentially that. Like there's a lot more Midsummer Festival to go, and who knows what they do to the May Queen at the end. It's very, it's very up in the air, and it doesn't seem like it's going to work out for her. That said, that's when the movie ends, though. And so the framing of it becomes this breakup metaphor, and that's funny. I think that's really, really quite amusing. Again, how I think Astor's really a funny filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think that element, the T Swift element of it, works best when you're viewing it as dark comedy.
Yeah,
but I think to view it as a more pure, just female empowerment thing is, and much like the witch interpretation, you also have to kind of ignore a lot of the work that was put into making this a more loaded and not purely uplifting. I guess it's very literally uplifting in the witch's case, but
it's elevated, all right.
It's certainly elevated. But that's why Midsommar does not. Part of why Midsommar did not work as well to me. I mean, kind of like you were saying, the reaction to Lighthouse was so tinged by the witch casting a big shadow over it that I guess that helps push it into the horror category, just because.
Well, what the hell else is it?
This baggage, but baggage from Hereditary did Midsommar no favors for me. Like it really felt to be like Hereditary went so hard, and like threw punches that I was not expecting in terms of oh man, that head just went right off. But Midsommar, it was like, okay, at the beginning of this, I mean, it opens with probably its gnarliest thing. I mean,
Yes.
Yes.
And then they're like, okay, so we're gonna do it's a Wicker Man thing. And like, oh yeah, okay, now 2 more hours of just a fully Wicker Man thing. And there's like, I don't know. I guess the twist at the end with the bear and the boyfriend. Maybe that was shocking to some people, but I just kind of, because exactly what we're talking about. The metaphor was far enough ahead of the horse that I was viewing it all through that lens in the theater the first time. It was not hitting me on any sort of visceral level. And like, I'm not surprised. I was not surprised by the turn stick at the end, because I had felt like just the portrayal of the boyfriend. Like, oh, you're like
the shittiest guy ever. Yeah.
You're fattening him up thematically for this ending that I was hoping there'd be some other twist for. And so I don't know. To me, it just felt like Hereditary really ran so that Midsommar could walk.
And I think the fact that they came out, I believe, like literally 1 year apart from each other.
Yeah.
I think had there been a little distance, maybe Hereditary wouldn't have cast such a long shadow. But even in that case, just the fact, and it kind of, Hereditary is kind of the same way. Although, as I said earlier, I think the horror filmmaking that Astor employs there does kind of elevate and paper over the fact that it's a very conventional plot that we've seen many times before. We don't really get that in Midsommar. So we're sitting there thinking, is this just going to be Wicker Man? Is there some other quirk to this? No, it's basically just Wicker Man again. Now, yes, there's an interpersonal relationship angle that makes it somewhat different, but that doesn't help me enjoy it on a genre level.
Wicker Man, now with more allegory.
Yeah.
A lot of allegory already in Wicker Man.
Exactly. That's why you don't need to put the cart.
Wicker Man has plenty on its mind already. We don't,
Taken as a funny, gory breakup movie, I do like Midsommar. I think it's solid. It might be my least favorite Ari Aster film, but not by a lot. It's just I got to put them 1, 2, 3. That's all. It's still very solid. It's a little too long. I think that hurts it in rewatch, especially. Not a film I'm going to see a lot more times, just because it's probably doesn't need to be 3 hours kind of thing. But it's still I'm just taken by the composition of his films, like the way they're put together and shot, and the music he uses, and there is a palpable sense of dread in the way he photographs a lot of stuff that I just find really compelling, and I think that is all to the end of making him seem like a pretentious filmmaker to some extent, but in the way Kubrick is, it's okay. It's good. I like that in a film. So, I just wanted to stand up for Midsommar a little bit there.
Yeah, it's not. I'm making it sound like it's a poster child for all this terrible stuff. It's an okay movie, I think. That's again, Hereditary did kind of knock me on my ass, because the other thing about that proved Astor can go really hard into horror stuff.
Yes,
and it felt like Midsommar was not going as hard as Hereditary. I mean, almost nothing goes as hard as Hereditary does in terms of upsetting you.
Hereditary is kind of, I think, achieved the status of sort of I don't know what The Exorcist had back in the 70s. Obviously, it wasn't as successful financially, but I think if you ask a lot of people, I think a lot of people saw Hereditary, and I think it scared everyone. I think everyone got a good thrill out of that movie, and I think it kind of exists as the scariest movie of the last decade or so. I think that's my perception.
In part just because it's the nastiest, which is what The Exorcist had going for it as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it feels, unafraid to be viscerally shocking. The big moment that comes, 20, 25 minutes into the movie where, someone who we think is a major character dies in a particularly impressive way. I never expected we would see that actually depicted, and what Astor does there that is so smart is he plays out that sequence where we don't see the body. We know it's in the back of the car. We don't see it. We don't see the head on the road until 5 minutes later. Like, he really draws it out, and we get to the point where we're thinking, okay, we're not going to see, the worst has passed. Mm-hmm. We're beyond, she's dead. It's terrible. We're beyond that. And then bam, smash cut to this rotting ant covered head on the road. I was absolutely knocked back in my seat. And it was one of those, like, in my mind, I'm going, bravo. Like, this, I did not expect you were going to show me this. And I was very impressed. And I think ultimately, though, that's kind of why, again, I like the movie. but why I was disappointed that it ended up being, oh, it's just a creepy cult movie.
That sequence is unbelievable.
It's fantastic.
The camera just on the kid's face, on the actor's name? I forget, the son.
One of the wolves.
It's just going home with him afterwards.
Yeah, just stuck on his face, going home, and he's
so
just
real.
Doesn't know what to do, does nothing, and it's so real, like you said. You feel like that's how this would play out. Oh my god, and then then you wake up hearing the mom screaming when she finds the car. It's just like, oh my god, it's a brutal one. It's especially tough to revisit that film as a parent now. That's a problem with a lot of these, honestly. A lot of dead children in elevated horror. Yeah,
I watched the Witch and the Babadook in the same week, and that really took it out of me. It really, my intention was to move on to Hereditary, and I was like, nope, I'm not not doing 3 nights in a row of this.
Yeah, it's
now that it's different. I was a very, very single man back in 2015. But anyway, this is weird. Like, I feel like I'm railing against this whole thing as a concept, and yet we have more examples of it working than not working.
Well, maybe it's the concept that is faulty. Matt Zoller's Sights quote on this that I wrote down, and I really liked it. It was like, elevated horror is like an artisanal cheeseburger. Make the goddamn cheeseburger. If it's delicious, no one will care what adjective you put in front of it. And maybe it's not a useful phrase. Maybe this is because it doesn't really denote what kind of movie you're going to get, other than it will have artistic pretensions, successful or not.
I actually think that does make it useful, though, because it does. That adjective tells me a lot. I know a lot of what I'm getting into there. And I am resistant to a lot of those things, apparently, on some sort of principled level. But I don't know. I mean,
on its face, it defies what horror is, too. On its face,
like it feels like it shouldn't exist, and yet it does exist. It is descriptive. You could fill that shelf in the video store.
Again, I try not to hold the label against the film, because it's often, again, not something that the film is taking on and is embracing itself. It's being put on it by some outside force. So, yes, when I see that somebody has called something elevated horror, I may kind of roll my eyes, and in the back of my mind, I'm saying, is this going to be another It Comes at Night? Or is this going to be something that's actually worth my time? But I try not to hold that against the movie. Like, I try to give the movie a fair shake, and either it works or it doesn't for me. But my resistance to the label, if I have resistance to the label, is more directed at the people who use it than the actual movies.
I mean, it's mostly a marketing invention, I would say, right? I mean, I don't know if anyone's actually advertised it in themselves as elevated horror, except for maybe It Comes at Night.
No, but I think people are pitching.
Yes,
based on that. I mean, if you walk into the A24 office, this is what they do at the A24 office. You have to put it that way. Yeah, I mean, I think it may initially have been more of a marketing thing, but people steer. There are people that embrace it more fully than others. Yeah, maybe Robert Eggers doesn't like it as much as whoever is making It Comes at Night or whatever. But
I mean, Ari Aster's leaned into it, I guess. I don't know. I'm really taken by his stuff, but like even in Beau is Afraid, you can kind of see him kind of like just like going like, I'm going straight at my own ass here. Check it out. I'm gonna get the spelunking lights. We're going deep here. We're gonna see what's going on. And I wonder if it's gonna have a burnout as a result. I mean, it's kind of the way horror works. Is anything that's hot will not be hot in 10 years. It'll be supplanted by something else. So I guess it's inevitable that this particular moment in horror will pass, and also at the same time, you got to remember, like, these are not the most popular horror movies getting released. They're the ones that I think people on the internet and folks like us like to talk about and gravitate towards. But, the Conjuring franchise has made so much more money than all of this. All of this is, there's a lot more horror movies getting released and making more money and being seen by more people than these movies. So it is always sort of niche. Yeah.
Was that not always the case, though? I mean,
of course.
The Halloween franchise was making more than Don't Look Now in the 70s.
Sure.
That's the other thing. Like, I mean, it's not a thing that's going to burn out entirely in some clear way. It's just, it's more trends. These will continue to happen. we lived through an era in the teens, it seems, where again the metaphors were more front and center. And
well, my hope is that
they'll probably swing back the other way, but they won't go away.
My hope is that they'll keep making these movies. They'll just be, it won't be necessarily a selling point. It'll just be, a kind of film you can make, a kind of film you can get released. I think they're still kind of succeeding with them. Longlegs this summer, the Oz Perkins film, was a pretty big hit. I think it's a pretty bad film, or not bad, but not great.
Oh, come on!
Kind of certainly pretentious. That's what
I don't know if I would say it's pretentious. I look at that Nicolas Cage performance, and I think that's a very self-aware goofiness going on with that performance that I happen to think was terrific. But
he's my favorite part of the movie for sure.
He makes some big choices with that, as Cage normally does.
That is what you hire Nicolas Cage for. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
You don't hire him for the small choices. All right, well, I think we solved it. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. No more questions. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, if just to kind of sum up, like, I want to see the genre making all kinds of different movies, schlocky ones, and artistically merited ones. So I don't want any of my reticence that I may have sort of expressed during this conversation to come off like I don't want these movies to exist, or I don't want any more of them to be made, or I don't want to hear this term anymore. That's not my position. I just think that I want a variety of the genre to be fully expressed, and I want a variety in the genre to receive acclaim. And even if a film is not dubbed elevated, that doesn't mean there's not artistic merit to it, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have something to offer beyond just a visceral horror experience.
Yeah, but I think if you want the acclaim, that's part of what comes with the elevation and all of that. And that's a thing that maybe readopting the Khan position, but that horror movies should not seek acclaim. Horror movies should not seek to be classy. They should be grubby little beasts that are happy wallowing in the gutter.
I don't know about seek, but let's look at like The Exorcist or Alien or The Shining, which to me are probably like, maybe my 3 favorite horror films of all time. Like, those are, as films, excellent films. They happen to also be excellent horror films. They happen to be excellent installments in their genre, but they're not films that necessarily set out, I don't think Ridley Scott was like, I want Alien to be nominated for X number of Oscars, even though it ultimately ended up being. He just wanted to make a really scary, intense science fiction horror film, and he did. And that's sort of what I'm talking about.
It's got subtext, all over the place.
But
it doesn't have to make an explicit allegory of anything.
Yeah, I'm not saying that these films should be seeking out intentionally being made with the idea of, we're going after the critics, we're going after awards, but you can make movies that satisfy fully as entries in the genre that also have stuff on their mind.
Yeah.
I guess where I am is I just want variety. I want these movies to keep getting made, and I also want the Terrifiers to keep getting made, even if that's not my particular cup of tea. I would like a wide panoply of types of horror movies coming out, and as
Absolutely.
such, I think that the elevated horror is of movement such as it is of the last decade is very much a net positive. Even if it's sort of an annoying term that is hard to classify, we just got really good movies that fall into it. Some of the best of the last 10 years. Genre, doesn't matter which genre, would be elevated horror films, I would say. And because of that, I have to count myself as sort of a fan of it, just because the results worked out. And there were a lot of good ones beyond, like what we talked about, the Luca Guadagnino horror movies that he made, Suspiria remake, Bones and All, Killing of a Sacred Deer. It's the Yorgos Lanthimos, probably my favorite Yorgos film. These are fucked up horror movies that, kind of get mistaken for art films, I think, a lot of the time, just because of the talent brought to bear against them. And that's let's keep doing that. Let's keep seeing what these people can make. These are profitable movies. They're more profitable than the usual movies that Luca Guadagnino would make, just because they have a sort of a built-in sell. So, I think we will keep getting them in some form or another. And I'm excited about that. I love that that's happening. I love that Robert Eggers has carved out this cool ass career for himself, and Ari Aster. I hope this all continues. And I want to see what else they can do, but if Robert Eggers just wants to keep making weird folklore movies like this, please do.
Yeah, well, we'll come back for Nosferatu, I'm sure, at the very least.
Please have me on for that if you're doing that. I cannot wait for that movie. I'm beyond excited for that.
Yeah, for sure. You got it, man. We'll do that. All right. Thank you for listening to us talk about elevated horror and all sorts of stuff as well. All right. Happy Halloween.